Hello to everybody watching this video right now. I just want to thank you all for tuning in to this edition of the Captain's Vlog. I'm Mudis Chowdhury. I'm the CEO here at RocketPhone.ai. And I have with me today my good friend and the very illustrious Gregg Johnson, who is CEO at Invoca, a company based in the US. So Gregg, the reason you and I have decided to create this video is because we were both watching very closely, right? When all this news of the layoffs and redundancies were coming out at the start of this year. And I know that you have some very specific advice for folks coming out of Salesforce. And that advice is gleaned from years of speaking to people at Salesforce who were looking to leave or, progress their careers outside of Salesforce. But I think that advice that you came up with is more relevant now than it probably ever was, given the sheer volume of people that are potentially leaving right now. So we thought it was worthwhile, right, just to create this video, sharing your thoughts and insights into life after Salesforce. And we think it's genuinely useful just to give as many people access to this advice as we possibly can. So I think we should just launch straight into this. So first of all, Gregg, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about you and your company, your journey into the Ohana, and kind of what you're doing at the moment. So over to you, man.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Mitch, thanks of all. It's great to see you. As I've probably talked to 20 ex-Salesforce employees over the past month, and the consistent refrain that I've said to them is, it's actually great to be connecting back with people in the network. I hate that it's under these circumstances, but I think with you, Mitch, Salesforce has meant so much to me in my career and the people especially. And it's ironic because at Invoca, we do a lot of work with Google as well. And so I've seen a lot of Googlers impacted too. So background on me, I'm the CEO of a company called Invoca, 100 million in revenue, 400 plus employees. I joined in 2016 after being at Salesforce for about a decade. I spent most of my time at Salesforce in product management roles. That gives you a little bit about me. And prior to joining Salesforce, I bounced around between tiny little startups, like little seed, A-stage startups, and then management consulting. I did work at BCG, but all working in software. So I've spent my entire career working in software. And I think just to go back where we started, Salesforce was a pivotal element of my career trajectory. And so I'm just really grateful for the impact that the company had on my career. I'm really grateful for all the amazing people that I've met. I'm grateful for all the support that the alumni community provides each other. And so my goal in this is just trying to help people where I can based on my experience, and trying to pay it forward at the end of the day.
I think you and I were both there for similar lengths of time. I was there for 10 years. You were there 10 years as well, roughly. And I think, it's quite interesting because before Salesforce, I think I was reading your article on LinkedIn and how you'd had your longest stint before Salesforce was 3 years. Is exactly the same here. And then you get into Salesforce and you're like, whoa, where am I? And you're in this company that's just growing and growing and growing, and you keep getting promoted and you keep getting yourself involved in more and more interesting projects. So why should I leave this, right? So when I was reading your article on the LinkedIn blog, you speak about sort of operating procedure at Salesforce and how, the operating procedure at Salesforce is not the same everywhere else. And that was quite interesting. So it'd be great if you could share what you mean by that.
Yeah, I think there were so many things that we took for granted at Salesforce in terms of what great leadership and great management were. Now, there were some bad things too. It's not all, it's not all peachy, good stories.
There's always bad stuff.
There's always bad stuff. But I found, as an example, when I left Salesforce and the things that I would do at Invoca, because I just thought that's what CEOs did. I'd watched and operated under Mark Benioff for a decade. And so we would go do things. And I just assumed that's how every CEO did things. And I was really amazed at Invoca when employees would come to me and say, hey, I really appreciate you doing X, Y, Z. I give you an example. One of the things that I do every Friday is I just write a note in Slack to the company about what I've been doing that week, what I've been seeing this past week. And most of the time it's about work. Some of the time it's not. I wrote a note on Friday about the 1-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine. And that was something I copied directly from Scott Dorsey, who is the CEO of a company called ExactTarget that Salesforce bought for $2.5 billion in 2013 and became sort of the marketing cloud. And I just did that because I thought that's what Scott did. And I thought that as a good CEO practice. And all these things that things like the V2 mom and getting focused around alignment that we all just assumed every company did. It was only when I left Salesforce that I realized a lot of companies don't do these things. And that's one of the things that I really encourage employees that have been impacted by layoffs recently is there are all these things that instinctively that you just think are normal that are actually differentiated in the market. And as you go out and talk to potential employers, I think you'll come to appreciate that your skill set is even stronger than you might realize. And that was one thing that really surprised me.
And that's really good insight. It's true because you just take for granted how you do your role, and there's a lot of stuff that I brought to Rocket Phone as well, just like you did. You talk about the modified version of the V2 Mon. We do the same thing here. It's just such a great way of communicating, from the top down across the whole business and keeping everybody kind of in sync in terms of, corporate objectives and how you achieve those things on the ground. You speak about, this is quite interesting, this next point that you speak about, which is, being humble in how you describe and apply your Salesforce experience, because I've interviewed people, right, who are like ex-Oracle or ex-IBM or name your big company, right? And I often hear this sort of like, well, when I was at Oracle, God, here we go again. So, and you point this thing out, and you make the point so succinctly. It really resonates with me. So it'd be great to hear about your view on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of two levels here. The very simple level. There is no easier way to get a gigantic eye roll in an interview than being, well, this is how we do it at Salesforce. And so very tactically, what I think people should do is sort of hold that information, let people ask. Like if you're in an interview process, it's inevitable when you're interviewing with companies that they will be curious how you did things at Salesforce. And instead of kind of going, hold that back a little bit, sit back in your seat and wait for people to ask. Because I think it's inevitable they will ask. I may be biased here as an ex-management consultant. I'm really big into best practices. I say to our executive team all the time, if you're trying to figure out a problem and it's not super strategic or proprietary, the first thing you should go do is go talk to your peer set and see how they've solved that problem. So I think you can sort of hold it back and you avoid the eye roll of, people being like, oh, here comes the big company person. But I do think people want to know. I think people at startups, they do see that experience and this practice and expertise. I think the second thing was more once you get into your job than when you're interviewing for a job is just being mindful to think about what were the core underlying reasons that Salesforce was successful and might have made the business practices at Salesforce as successful as they were, and do those conditions apply to the world that your new company is in? And so the example I would give you, the space that we're in, first of all, Invoca's born in the cloud, 100% cloud native, everything we've done in the cloud. And we are not in a market where you are converting on-premise customers to cloud customers. Like that is not the market that we're in. And if you think about Salesforce, which especially like when you and I were there and a little bit before, that was a huge part of the go-to-market motion, right? It was like, how do you take, on-premise and convert it to cloud consumption? And so sort of thinking about what are the underlying market dynamics that come with being in a converting from on-prem to cloud world, and how does that make certain business practice successful? And are those business practices as relevant in a world where you're building a market from scratch and you're not doing a bunch of conversions? Yeah. I think just having that humility to go back and examine, these practices worked at Salesforce. Well, why? And then identifying why, and then going, did those practices apply at my new company? Before you just blindly go off and be like, the Salesforce playbook says do X, Y, Z, because you're going to get a massive role in the interview process and even the post-interview process. And I can tell you, if there are people from Invoca on this call, they're like, my CEO who used to work at Salesforce.
It's so true. I remember in my first few years at Salesforce, half the sales cycle was like, security, data residency, encryption at rest, encryption in transit, long, questionnaires about, is this platform stable and resilient and all this sort of stuff. Yeah. And we did that constantly. But the market's moved on, as you say, and people just, the perception of cloud in the general marketplace now, it's safe, we trust it. A critical mass of our processes and applications are in the cloud already, so it's all good. Right? And so you're right. If you bring that mindset now to your next organization, it's going to be, it's going to be, what's the word? Not disrupting. Yeah, probably disrupting to whatever you're doing, because it's not relevant anymore. So that's a really good example. Sorry, Greg.
I was just going to say, the other one I give you is you think about sales capacity planning. Like,
Yeah.
At Salesforce, there is a lot of reliance on the spreadsheet math. How many reps do I have? What's their quota? What's their quota attainment? You could just keep throwing more reps at the problem. Whereas when you're in a startup market, a lot of what you're trying to judge in an emerging market is how fast can I throw sales capacity at the market? How fast is the market growing? And it's not a spreadsheet example or a process anymore. It's really trying to fine tune, how much more incremental sales capacity can I throw? And you can model whatever you want on a spreadsheet, but just, it actually depends on what your reps deliver and having a really tight feedback loop. And so it's things like that just recognizing like the company that I work at now is in a different place than Salesforce was at that period of time. And what does that mean for how I should operate the business?
Yeah, just presuming that you walk into a smaller organization and they just have product market fit across everything. It's really dangerous, right? Yeah, absolutely right. So do you think that Salesforce employees, slip into a sort of reality distortion field when they've been there for a while and we're a multi-billion-dollar business now, and any company under a certain hundreds of millions of revenue is actually a startup company?
I think this is the biggest challenge that people at Salesforce have, and I've been trying to talk to folks about for years, not only recently, is, when you're at Salesforce, you think of everything as a startup, but by definition, the entire category of software is smaller than Salesforce. And so I made this joke on LinkedIn, like somebody I was talking to said, I want to go interview at a startup. And I said, what kind of company is he looking at? And they said, well, I'm interviewing at Twilio. I was like, Twilio is like a $2 billion revenue company. They're publicly traded. That's not a startup. So I think one of the biggest struggles people have, and this is important, I think, to your happiness and your satisfaction in your job, is starting to understand what's the difference between a $10 million revenue company, a $100 million revenue company, a $1 billion revenue company, a $2 billion revenue company. Like, I'll give you an example of a good friend of mine here in the East Bay who is over at Okta. I had dinner Saturday night with another London friend who's at Okta. And Okta's not a startup. Okta's been public for a couple years. I want to say they're like $2 billion in revenue. And so the nature of the work that you're going to do if you're interviewing for a job at Okta is very different than the nature of the work that you're going to be doing if you interview at a company, say, Invoca, which is very different than a company that, is like 50 employees, 5 or 10 million in revenue. And I think it's really, and some jobs don't exist. Like, actually, I'm having a chat with an old colleague on Friday, and he emailed me yesterday, and he said, I realized, like, my job doesn't exist at companies that have less than 1,000 employees. He's like an agile coach in an engineering organization. And I was really excited for him that he came to that understanding on his own, because if you don't understand these subtleties, your job search process is going to be super inefficient. Like, I'll give you an example. I was talking with somebody, not a Salesforce person, but somebody who was impacted by layoffs at another organization who's in corporate development, sort of an M&A function. And we were talking about the fact that, like, companies don't even have that function until you get to 100 or 150 million in revenue. Or another team at Salesforce, the pricing team. I was talking to a former business school classmate of mine who's at Bain, who does pricing work. And I said, my guess is that most software companies, they don't even have a pricing team until they get to like 300 or 400 million in revenue. Right. And he goes, I guess it's like 400 to 500 million in revenue. So I think starting to understand, does your role exist at a smaller company, or is it sort of a more generalist role? And then what do those roles look like? Like, at a $10 million company in customer success, you're helping roll out like Gainsight or CRM. At a 150 or 200 million company, those things are already established. Those processes are in place. You're refining, you're iterating. And so my advice here is just like, spend some time, in addition to applying for jobs, spend some time talking with people at different stages of companies in your network and asking them what their job's like. Because I think it'll help you understand the future of how would my job be different at a company that's smaller than Salesforce And there are different flavors of that because by definition, the entire category is smaller than Salesforce. And it's really hard to understand from reading things. I think the best way to figure that out is by going and talking to people.
Yeah. I think the example that you use is post M&A integration professional. I don't need one of those right now.
You don't need one of those people. Yeah. And if they spend time, and again, like if I had to guess, we've done one acquisition. We did a sizable acquisition. We don't have that role. And I don't think companies have that role till they're probably 300 million in revenue. And so just starting to get a sense of that, I think will help people be efficient. So you're not wasting your time looking for jobs where not only there may not be a good fit, but the role doesn't even exist.
Yeah. And in fact, the other example that you used, I mean, you just mentioned it as well, which is, I mean, the M&A, post M&A integration role is an obvious one, but the less obvious one is pricing specialist, because I spoke to a bunch of pricing guys, and they asked me questions about, well, how do you price your product? How do you know you're getting the right level of value? Are you delivering value? Are you maximizing your margins, et cetera, et cetera? I said, dude, we just take out a spreadsheet, look at our costs. we look at the parking lot of our customer. If they have, Ferraris and Mercedes, then the price goes up. I mean, I'm being facetious, but it's totally
It's totally true. Like, who runs the pricing team at Invoca? Me. And I wish my job were full-time pricing, but it's not. And I just, I think there are these sort of shades of gray that people don't quite understand. Because again, every company looks smaller than Salesforce. And if you've been at Salesforce for 5 or 10 years, that's a perfectly understandable perspective on the market. It's just not super helpful when you're looking for jobs.
Yeah, indeed. On a sort of related note then, so like, when I get approached by large company candidates, and and especially, I mean, being Ohana, you want to be supportive of the alumni and everyone that you work with when you were at Salesforce, but obviously there's a difference between the sort of skill sets that they develop and the capabilities that they develop and the relevance of those capabilities into this next company, and in my case that's kind of Rocket Phone. So there is the nature of your Salesforce experience, right? And you make you give some advice around recognizing the nature of your experience. Could I ask you to sort of elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, I think let me flip it on its head for a second.
Okay.
One of the things that I say to potential hirers is, like, people will ping me and go, "Hey, do you know such and such person from Salesforce?" And I think especially if you get into the kind of real startup world, like A and B, C stage companies, there's a lot of skepticism. Like, will these individuals roll up their sleeves? I had a conversation like this on Friday. I was talking to an investor that was talking about approaching a former Salesforce person about a CEO role. And their question was like, will this person roll up their sleeves and do work? And my point is, like, you got to think about the nuances of your Salesforce experience. And so this person had been in a sales position in Europe. And I said, in the early days at Salesforce, when you were leading sales in a new geography, you were like out on the frontier. You were pioneering. You had to be scrappy. You had to make things up. Like, but you'll know this from your experience. Like, you weren't getting a lot of support from HQ. And even the support you got from HQ was probably pretty ineffective because people were spelling color.
I had hair before all this started.
Exactly. So that role at Salesforce is not the same as somebody who's working in product marketing in Sales Cloud from San Francisco headquarters. And like, it was the same thing for me. Like, I made a very deliberate attempt in my time at Salesforce to work on new and emerging products where I would have a broader purview into what was going on, as opposed to being a very kind of small purview in a big organization. And so I think thinking about the subtlety of your experience and how it applies to the role that you're interested in, and making that more explicit, like, rather than letting a potential interviewer hire connect those dots on their own, trying to help them connect those dots proactively, and thinking about how do you tell a story about your Salesforce experience that's relevant. The other thing too, I said that somebody I was talking to a few weeks ago, a lot of the people that you're going to be interviewing with, they've never worked at an organization that is as big as Salesforce. They don't understand the level of specialization that happens in a software company when you're at 40, 50, 60,000 people. And so this person that I was speaking to had been in a role building product for a long time and then had moved over into a role in CSG, which is the customer success group, sort of helping frame how product got adopted. And he was talking about like, I want to get back to building product. And I said to him, I'm like, from the outside in, an interviewer may never know that you weren't building product the past year or two. So don't stab yourself in the foot by talking about getting back to building product. Just talk about your experience of building products for the past 10 years. And, you know, if they ask questions about that 1.5 to 2 year gap where you were in a different role, then address it. But like, don't proactively be like, I haven't been building product the past 2 years, because you're just hurting yourself in the interview process. So I think, you know, again, if you've been at the company a long time, you think everybody understands the level of specialization in a 50,000 person software company. They do not. Like 90% of the market has never been in a world where you can have that level of specialization. So I think sort of trying to frame your experience in the language of where a company is at is really important. And this is, again, why my number one advice is, even in parallel to interviewing, go talk to people that are working in companies the size of which you're targeting, because you'll get a sense of what those companies are going through, what kind of scale they operate at, and you can translate your experience into language they'll understand, as opposed to assuming that they can understand Salesforce language, which they may not be able to do.
Yeah, and that's such good advice, because on the one hand, speaking to companies who fit that criteria, not looking for a role with them, is a very low risk way of finding out more about, you know, whether you want to do this or not, or whether you are a good fit.
Yeah.
But it's also a great way of, if you do want to do that, then making sure that you're forearmed with the right information so you can put your best foot forward.
Yeah, there's nothing better than being in an interview process and talking to somebody and be like, oh, I was talking to somebody at your company, understand you're trying to do that. So people are going to be like, wow, like you're doing your homework. So yeah, totally agree.
Fantastic. So compensation. What should folks be expecting coming out of Salesforce? Should they be demanding the same levels of pay? Should they be expecting more or less? Or
yeah, I mean, this is an area, unfortunately, I think where like the world has completely changed in the past 12 to 18 months. So let me take a step back. Even before you look at sort of the conditions of the current labor market, let me just talk a little bit about how companies look at compensation. Generally, companies look to align their compensation with companies that are of kind of like-minded size. So, for example, us as a late-stage private company, we mostly benchmark our compensation to late-stage private companies, maybe like very early public companies. But, you know, in the startup world, like you're just not aligning your compensation one-to-one with a Google, a Facebook, or Salesforce. Like you just don't have the capital to do it. Correct. And so I think sort of understanding some of that, doing some research on compensation when you come in is important. And then I think the second thing that's really critical too, which I'm sure you felt this as well, is like, you don't realize what impact having RSUs vesting every single quarter has on your lifestyle. I know, you know, for me, when I left Salesforce, we've been very fortunate. My wife and I had just renovated our house. We have 3 kids. We had expanded our house so that we essentially knew that we had enough space for 3 boys, even through their teenage years. And we had a little bit of money saved for them to go to college. And I was sort of okay of like, I've got those fundamentals taken care of. Like, do I have my retirement taken care of? No. Do I have all my college taken care of? No. But I can get to those in time. But when you go off what I call the RSU gravy train, like it is real. And so I think sitting down and having a conversation with the other significant members of your family about like what finances are going to look like and what's that going to mean is really important. Because when you go to a private company, you know, like you're not selling stock every quarter. I joke about this in the article. I remember talking to somebody who said, I just try not to talk to any Salesforce people in May, August, November, February, because that's when all the options vest. That's when the vesting happens, and people are like, cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. And so I think, you know, being kind of proactively having a sense of what that looks like and what that means. And again, I'm not saying that that means you have to take a compensation hit. I think understanding your goals around compensation and where you are in that personal narrative will affect what kind of company you go to. Like if, you know, I'll just make up an example. If you're a young family who's got a couple kids and you've got to pay for, you know, private school and you're figuring out where you're going to get a bigger house, like, and compensation is really important to you right now, that probably is going to bias you towards a public company. Like think of an Okta or ServiceNow or somebody like that, where the compensation change won't be as dramatic because you've got those RSUs or options that are still liquid. Whereas if you start going to an early stage private company, like you don't know when you're going to get liquidity. And so I just think having a there's no judgment here. There's no right or wrong. It's about understanding, what things will look like for you in your near-term future and what's required and what's not required from a financial point of view.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you can be completely crazy. The conversation that my wife and I had was so much. You have 2 young children, currently 4 years old, twins, and then you have a teenage daughter who at the time was 13, actually just turned teen, and we have a huge mortgage. Yeah, it's true. Okay,
Yeah.
right. So okay, yeah, you want to leave Salesforce guaranteed security, well, nigh on guaranteed security, to start a company where we're going to probably deposit all of our savings, if not into the company, but into other things that we're doing to compensate for the lack of income.
Yeah.
Are you sure about this? I'm like, well, yeah, I don't know. It's just, it takes a lot of adjustment. But in my case, it was particularly extreme, I guess.
Yeah, and I think what's important is you have that discussion up front. Like what you don't want to do is you don't want to go make a decision and then have 3 or 4 years later, you're kind of like, whoa, what am I doing? And more importantly, your significant other, she or he is saying like, hey, did I sign up for this? And so I'm a big believer in making deliberate decisions as opposed to like you just end up making a decision. You're like, oh, I didn't realize it could have gone left or right, and I just went right. So I think this is an important one to think about the ramifications of, make sure that between you, your family, your loved ones, that like you're all kind of understanding what kind of decision you're making. And again, it doesn't mean, especially in a tighter labor market, it may just veer you one way or the other. Like if you have very clear, concrete needs for cash, go to a public company, like where you're still going to have some of that stock kicker. Whereas if you're not at that point, you can take a little bit more risk. You can have a little bit more of a long-term perspective, then maybe veer more towards private, but just make a deliberate decision.
Absolutely. That's interesting. Actually, from a hiring manager perspective, I do occasionally interview people. Like there was a guy who was pretty senior at Zoom, and he was sitting opposite me, and he said, look, dude, I'd love to come and work at Rocket Phone, but I need this level of basic salary, I need this level of bonus or commission, and I also want this amount of stock. And I just said, we're not the right place for you.
Yeah.
Stay where you are. Stay where you are. And I think it's incumbent upon the hiring managers to be really transparent about that as well. So you talk about language and the vocabulary of small organizations, and this resonates with me because it can be quite disorientating when you're used to a set of terms and constructs and lingua franca, whatever you want to call it, and you walk into a new organization. And it doesn't need to be a smaller organization, it can be any organization, right, where they're just different emphases, different priorities, and therefore the language that they use is going to be very different as well.
Yeah.
And you advise around how to deal with that. So that's actually quite interesting. I'll leave it to you to sort of verbalize that.
Yeah, I think, I would say this was a particularly acute challenge for me as a CEO because I was being exposed to language that and concepts I'd never had to think about in my Salesforce days. And so I think the good news here is if you're going to a publicly traded company or you're interested in publicly traded companies, number one thing you can do, go to their investor relations websites, go listen to their earning calls, read their earnings call transcripts, look at their investor presentations. You'll learn what metrics and what things are important. And then if you're thinking about going to a private company, there are some great resources. So a guy named Jason Lemkin runs a community and a podcast called SAFTR, where you're going to hear things like, LTV to CAC, gross net retention, quota carrying capacity and quota achievement, like all these things that you're like, whoa, I've never heard of those things before. And the good news in today's world is the SaaS cloud computing community has matured to a point where there are lots of resources where you can go read and understand what these things mean. But again, I think the farther down into the startup world you're going, the bigger the disconnect in terms of the language and how people talk about the business. Yeah. And the more you can educate yourself, the less disconnected you'll sound. And so, as I said, if I think about, all the different podcasts, all the different communities you can read on, I think reading up, there are kind of 8 to 10 core metrics that are important to understand. And I think that will just help you relate to the business and be able to speak to the goals of the business in a way that makes you sound more like a startup friendly person as opposed to somebody who's coming from a super big company who's not in touch with startup reality.
Absolutely. I had a conversation, I've had many conversations with folks at risk, just like you have, Greg, and there was one chap who you probably know them, they've been there over 10 years, and I just said, just see it as an unplanned PTO, right? Yeah. so spend a bit of time, use the opportunity to kind of smell the flowers, because these opportunities don't come along very often. And you make a similar sort of observation, don't you, in your blog article about that?
It is. This is really hard, because this is where the conversations I've had today are fundamentally different than the conversations I've had the past 2 or 3 years. In the past 2 or 3 years, the labor market was hot enough that you could take time out. And I think for me, because of Salesforce sabbatical and other things, like I was able to spend a summer away from my job before I embarked on my CEO adventure. I spent time with my kids that they still talk about to this day with my dad. And I look back at that, and who knows if I will have another job again or if I'll work at Invoca for the rest of my life. I love the company I'm at, but if I ever do a job switch again, I definitely want to take a break and get some of that time. Now, in today's market, I don't know how discretionary of an opportunity that is, and I want to be empathetic with people. I guess the one thing I would say from talking to folks is, I think it's very easy in today's world to sit in front of your computer and do LinkedIn doom scrolling all day long, of just spending endless amount of times looking for jobs, spinning your wheels. Mm-hmm. And I'm not a very organized person. Full disclosure, I'm not a getting things done person. But the people that I've talked to, we've talked about is the idea of setting discrete goals, mm-hmm. and sort of saying okay, this week and next week, here's what I'm trying to do. Yeah. And building that sense of momentum that you're getting things done. And that I feel like, everybody, most of the people that Muj, you and I work with, they're overachievers. They want to get a lot done. And so setting a benchmark of what you're trying to get done lets you complete that benchmark and lets you feel better about saying, okay, it's 3:00 in the afternoon. It's a beautiful day. I'm going to go take a bike ride. I'm going to go do something that's good for me, as opposed to just sitting there for 12 hours a day in my home office, endlessly scrolling with no sense of purpose. Mm-hmm. And I think putting some boundaries and some guidelines and some goals around what you're trying to do will help give you a sense of fulfillment that then lets you actually take advantage of the time and do some things for yourself. Because I'm an optimistic person. I'd love to hope for all the people that are out there, you're going to find another role. You're going to be back at it, cranking soon enough. And you're going to look back at this time and be like, wow, I wish I would have taken more advantage of that. I think in today's environment, the only way to give yourself permission to do that is to set kind of clear goals as to what you're trying to achieve. Because otherwise you're just going to spin. And that's I'm not a practitioner here. I don't know this from my own experience, but as I think about what I would do if I were in that scenario, I think that's the only way that I could kind of give myself permission to go spend some time for myself, with my family, with my friends and my loved ones, which I do think trying to make, lemonade out of lemons, that is a good goal to try to have.
It's absolutely true, and I think some of that stuff is stuff that you should be doing anyway, which is carving out the balance of
CEO best practice would probably be to do that, but I don't do it myself.
I got to thank you for saying though that you're disorganized, because that actually helps with my imposter syndrome. Because I feel the same way. I'm so disorganized. How can I possibly do this job?
It's getting harder for me, but I can kind of keep track of most of it in my head. So I don't write it down, and I'm I eventually find a way out. But I joke around with with our executive team. I'm like, oh yeah, we're running late as usual. This is a standard Gregg Johnson meeting. But I think what's important about this, for if you're an infected Ohana or from another company, is just having that structure will give yourself the mental permission to do some things outside of hunt for jobs. And I think that's really important to keeping a good, healthy state of mind.
I absolutely agree. And my last question before we just get into closing remarks is really about the future of Salesforce from an employee perspective, all this stuff that's going on with the activist investors and so on. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
It's I was talking about this over dinner with a friend this weekend. It's really interesting right now because I love the company. I love everything that the company has represented. I love how the company treats employees. Like I look to Salesforce as an example for how we want to engage with our employees at Invoca. But there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, like I think people, hear these terms like activist investors and they kind of have a sense of what it means, but they don't really know. And I'm going to be presumptuous for a moment. Mooj and I know as CEOs, because everybody thinks that CEO just can kind of do what you want. You don't. You work for your shareholders and you work for your board. And what's interesting is just kind of simplify. At a company like a privately held company, at least our company, Mooj, and say if it's different for you, like the board approves things like setting your budget. How much money can you spend over the course of the year? And then there are certain things that go to board votes. There are certain things that go to shareholder votes. At a publicly traded company, one of the things that the shareholders have control over is the composition of the board. And if you look at a lot of the other big technology companies like Google and Facebook, they have these structures in place where the CEOs, for every share they had a special class of stock, which meant that, like, say I have a share of Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg has a share of Facebook. But Mark shares had a different structure where his share would get him 50 votes on any matter relative to my single vote. Yeah. And so what that meant is that Zuckerberg essentially controls the Facebook board and controls the decisions that Facebook is going to make. Mark Benioff doesn't have that. Salesforce went public before these kind of governance structures became popular. And so, the board, I would say at Salesforce, is largely a board that has been around for a long time, that's friendly to Mark, friendly to Salesforce. They've already started to bring in new board members over the past few months.
Yes.
And over the next 6 to 9 to 12 months, like the board of directors will go out for a vote amongst the shareholders. And, a Mark Benioff vote is the same as I'm still a shareholder, still is a Gregg Johnson vote. Now, Mark Benioff has a lot more shares than I do, probably a lot more shares than you do, Mooch, but our votes are the same. And so it just, one of the things I think all of us who spent time at Salesforce would know, Salesforce was not the most cost or expense conscious company in the world. And I think a lot of that's going to change. And I think the company's going to have to be a lot tighter on how it manages expenses and cash. And, the question I have in my head is like, how long does Mark want to run a company like this? Because I think the way that Salesforce is going to be run in the next 5 years is going to be very different from the way it's been run for the past 25 years. Yeah. And I have no doubt that Mark has an immense amount of love and attachment to the company, and the same with Parker and same with a lot of the people that have been there for a while. But I think that the way the company is going to have to manage the business, especially if growth continues at the levels that growth is at, like in the 15-20% range, it's going to be a different place. I'm hopeful that it will maintain some of the magic and some of those things that made it such a great place to work. But it's also going to be pretty different, I think, over the next 5 years. And so, I think just people should be clear about that and how things are changing. I haven't spoken to a lot of folks over the past month that are still there. But certainly, the past 3 months, I think, have been different than anything, we ever experienced. So I'm hopeful as a shareholder. I think as a former employee or as a current employee, I would be sort of eyes wide open around what I think the employee experience is going to be like over the next 5 to 10 years, and how it's probably going to be pretty different than what it was like, between 2000 and 2018.
Yeah, I think it's almost like you kind of think that this may have happened sooner. And I think Mark's done a terrific job of, putting his brand of sort of management and process into that business. And I think it's been great for the employees. I think it's been tremendous for helping. I mean, the growth at Salesforce has been phenomenal, over the last 10 years. And I guess you probably guessed the same. That level of growth probably isn't sustainable in quite the same way. And in order to be more profitable, which I suspect what some of these investors want, then some things just have to change. I think I tend to agree with you, actually, and you're absolutely right. The employee experience is probably up in the air.
Yeah.
What happens with that?
I think it'll always be a great place to work, but an example I always use is I used to plan on a family vacation in early August to the Big Island in Hawaii because every year, the executive team would take 300 or 400 execs from around the world, fly them to the Big Island for 4 days of planning and Ohana meetings, and then you just stick around for another week. And I remember when I left Salesforce, my kids are like, "So are we going to the Big Island this year with Invoca?" And I'm like, "Nope." And it's not to say that the perks were all that was great about Salesforce. There was a lot of other great things about the employee experience, but the perks didn't hurt. And I think, every company right now, you've got to either deliver on your revenue growth objectives or you have to be more profitable. You can't get caught in the middle. Mm-hmm. And I think, the reality is Salesforce has gone from being a 30% growth company to like a 15% growth company. And it either needs to get back to a 30% growth company or it needs to operate like a 15% growth company. And I think that's sort of the open question as to how the company goes over the next few years. And I wish the company luck. I love the company with all my heart. I want to do everything I can for the people. As a stockholder, I really hope the company does well. But I think it's just, it looks like a different reality over the next 2 or 3 years than what you and I are experienced.
The Ohana will always be the Ohana, though.
Oh, I agree. And the last thing I will say as words of encouragement to all of you that are looking for jobs, the people in this community are amazing. Yeah. They want to help you. And you should not feel like you are asking for help when you reach out to folks. I know for me, I try to proactively say to people, I'd love to catch up. Like, I'm not doing you a favor by catching up. You're actually helping me rekindle a relationship that I value, and I just haven't had an excuse to talk to you over the years. And so for all of you that are out there job hunting, there are really good people in this community. They want to help you. We're here to support you. Do not feel bad about reaching out for help. I realized as a CEO, people like helping one another. It makes them feel good. And so I think there are lots of people out here to support you. You've got a great future ahead of you. It's just a matter of navigating through these things currently. And you'll be part of this great community that takes care of one another, that helps one another, and continues to do great things. So same for me. If anybody wants to ping me, you can reach me at ceo@invoca.com. I'm happy to help. I'm doing a call, I think tonight, with someone in Australia at like 10 p.m. my time. She's like,
"Look at you.
Right your time." I'm like, I'm a night owl, and like I want to go back to Australia one day, and maybe one day if I'm going back to my kids, I'll email you and ask you for good restaurant recommendations. But I think we're all here to help, to do everything that we can, and keep your head up because you're gonna be fine. It's going to be a rough period to deal with, and don't be afraid to ask for help.
That's phenomenal. Gregg, thank you so much for making the time. I know you're a very, very busy person, but I think this is going to be really useful to a lot of people. So thank you so much. What I will do is I'll put a link to your article at the bottom of this video, so people can click on that and just go through some of that detail. But thank you to everybody for watching, but mostly thank you, Gregg, for spending time with us today.
As I said, like, it's awesome. We were talking earlier, like, I believe in paying it forward. I believe in karma. I believe in the karma of the Ohana. It's all going to be good. And if there's anything I can do to help, please don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Gregg.